Hello friends, and welcome back to another episode of Background History for Bedtime. Please remember to comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you there. We're going to get into some of the biggest scandals of different kings and royalty during the times of medieval Europe. Settle in and let's begin. Let us settle quietly into the shadowed halls of medieval Europe, where stone walls hold secrets and candlelight flickers softly against gold and velvet. This evening's story is about kings, crowns, and the moments when power quietly unraveled behind closed doors, not on battlefields, but in chambers of whispered promises, broken vows, and carefully guarded silence. As the world outside the castle gates grows still, we turn our attention to the private lives of medieval rulers. These were men placed high above ordinary life, crowned by God, bound by tradition, and watched endlessly by courts, clergy, and rivals. Yet even under such scrutiny, scandal found its way into royal households, slipping through locked doors and sealed letters. In the medieval world, a king's personal behavior was never truly personal. Love affairs, disputed marriages, secret children, and whispered crimes could shake entire kingdoms. A single rumor could weaken alliances. A hidden truth could spark rebellion. A private failure might be remembered longer than a victorious war. These scandals spread slowly, carried by servants, monks, and travelers, growing heavier with each retelling. Tonight, we will move gently through some of the biggest royal scandals of medieval Europe. Stories of forbidden relationships that threatened dynasties. Accusations that stained crowns beyond repair. Choices made in secrecy that reshaped history in ways no one intended. These tales are not told here for shock or judgment, but as quiet reflections on power and human fragility. Imagine the setting as we begin. A long corridor lit by torches, footsteps echoing, then fading. A king alone with his thoughts as the court sleeps. Outside, the city rests under a dark sky, unaware of the tensions coiled behind palace walls. In these moments, history often turned not with swords, but with whispers. As we drift through these stories, we will take our time. There is no rush. The drama has long since settled into dust and parchment, softened by centuries of distance. What remains is a calm unfolding of how scandal worked in an age without headlines, when silence could be more dangerous than confession. So breathe slowly. Let the world of crowns and rumors come into focus. In the stillness of the evening, we begin Part 1, where the first scandal quietly takes shape. Part 1. The King Who Loved Too Much. Let us begin slowly in England at the turn of the 14th century, when the air itself seemed heavy with rain and expectation. Castles rose from damp earth like permanent shadows, and the monarchy rested not only on bloodlines, but on performance. A king was expected to rule, to marry well, to produce heirs, to command respect, and above all, to appear unshakable. Yet sometimes, the deepest scandals were not born from cruelty or ambition, but from affection that refused to stay within its assigned boundaries. Edward II ascended the English throne in 1307, following the death of his formidable father, Edward I. His father had been a warrior king, hard-edged and relentless, feared by enemies and respected by allies. The son inherited the crown, but not the temperament. From the very beginning, whispers followed him. Not loud accusations, but soft unease. Something about the new king felt fragile to the men who expected iron. Edward II had grown up surrounded by expectations he never quite embodied. He preferred music to warfare, companionship to conquest, conversation to command. These traits alone did not make a scandal, but medieval kingship left little room for softness. The crown demanded authority that could be felt from a distance. Into this already tense atmosphere stepped Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon nobleman, charming, clever, and intensely present. He was everything Edward seemed to lean toward emotionally. The two had met years earlier, during Edward's youth, and their bond had grown deep and unmistakable. When Edward became king, one of his first acts was to bring Gaveston back to court and elevate him far beyond what his rank would normally allow. Titles, lands, wealth, influence, all poured into Gaveston's hands with startling speed. To the court, this was not merely favoritism. It felt like displacement. Gaveston mocked nobles openly, gave them cutting nicknames, and behaved with a confidence that bordered on insolence. But worse than the insults was the intimacy. Edward deferred to him, trusted him, listened to him in ways he did not listen to his own advisors or barons. In medieval Europe, intimacy itself could be political dynamite. The king's marriage did little to quiet the tension. Edward had married Isabella of France, a union meant to secure peace and alliance with one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Isabella was young, intelligent, and politically astute, yet from the beginning, she found herself standing in the shadow of Gaveston. At public events, Gaveston was granted precedence. At ceremonies, he appeared beside the king while the queen waited. Even at Edward's coronation, Gaveston's presence overshadowed Isabella's role, an almost unthinkable breach of protocol. The symbolism was not lost on anyone watching. The barons watched carefully. They did not yet act, but they counted each slight. Rumors spread quietly at first. Chroniclers wrote cautiously, hinting without stating. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston was described as excessive, improper, unnatural, though the language of the time avoided clarity. What mattered was not how modern eyes might interpret their bond, but how medieval society processed it. Kings were expected to love their favorites, but not this much. To love one man more than the kingdom itself was the accusation, even if no one dared phrase it so directly. Political pressure mounted. The nobility demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward resisted, then conceded, then reversed himself, bringing Gaveston back again. Each return inflamed resentment further. The court fractured into factions, loyalty measured not to the crown, but to proximity to the king's favorite. This is how scandal grows in a medieval world, not through sudden revelation, but through repetition. Each act reinforcing the sense that something fundamental was out of balance. Eventually, patience ran out. In 1312, a group of powerful barons captured Gaveston. They did not wait for royal approval. They did not seek a trial. They moved swiftly, decisively, as though eager to end something that had lingered too long. Gaveston was executed on a hill overlooking Blacklow Hill, stabbed and beheaded. His death was not merely an act of violence. It was a statement. The king had been corrected. Edward's grief was immediate and consuming. He withdrew, mourned publicly, and never forgave the barons involved. But grief did not restore authority. If anything, it exposed weakness. The king who could not protect his closest companion appeared unable to protect his realm. And yet, the scandal did not end with Gaveston's death. Years later, Edward formed another intense bond, this time with Hugh Despenser the Younger. Once again, favor turned excessive. Once again, lands and titles flowed. Once again, the nobility watched with a familiar dread. The pattern had set. This repetition hardened perceptions. Edward was no longer seen as unlucky or misunderstood. He was seen as incapable of learning restraint. The scandal transformed from a personal failing into a political diagnosis. His queen, Isabella, increasingly isolated and humiliated, eventually aligned herself with opposition forces. She crossed the channel, gathered support, and returned with an army. The invasion was swift. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and imprisoned. What followed is one of the most chilling endings in medieval royal history. Edward II died in captivity in 1327. Officially, his death was attributed to natural causes. Unofficially, rumors spread almost immediately. Stories of a brutal, symbolic murder involving a red-hot poker circulated widely. Whether true or not, the persistence of the tale reveals something essential. The king's scandal demanded a dramatic ending. In medieval memory, Edward's reign became a cautionary tale. Chroniclers framed it as moral failure, not simply because of his relationships, but because those relationships appeared to override duty. The crown, in this telling, could not survive divided loyalty. Yet when we sit with the story quietly centuries later, it feels less like scandal alone and more like collision. A man raised for a role he could not fully inhabit. A system that demanded performance over authenticity. A court that interpreted intimacy as threat. Edward II's greatest scandal was not simply who he loved, but how visibly that love disrupted the careful choreography of medieval kingship. As the dust settled over his reign, England did not remember him as a tyrant or a conqueror, but as a king undone by closeness, a ruler whose private affections became public crisis. And in that sense, this scandal lingers softly through history, not loud with violence, but heavy with implication. It reminds us that in medieval Europe, power was not only exercised through armies and laws, but through appearances, priorities, and the fragile balance between self and crown. As the torches dim on Edward's story, the silence that follows is not empty. It is filled with questions that medieval Europe asked again and again. What happens when a king refuses to separate love from rule? Let us drift onward. Part 2. The King Who Destroyed an Order. We drift now across the Channel and settle into France, into a reign that looked powerful, controlled, and immaculate on the surface. Stone cathedrals rose higher than ever before. Royal authority expanded. Coinage circulated with the king's face stamped clearly upon it. To many contemporaries, this was the image of a strong medieval monarchy at its peak. And yet, beneath this polished exterior, one of the most explosive scandals of medieval Europe was quietly taking shape. Not a scandal of romance or passion, but one of accusation, manipulation, and calculated destruction. A scandal so vast that it erased an entire institution from the map of history. This is the story of King Philip IV of France, later remembered as Philip the Fair, and the sudden, shocking fall of the Knights Templar. Philip IV ruled France from 1285 to 1314. He was tall, pale, and reserved, with a reputation for emotional distance and cold resolve. Chroniclers often remarked on his stillness, his silence, his unreadable expression. Where other kings inspired loyalty through charisma or fear through violence, Philip inspired obedience through sheer authority. He believed deeply in the supremacy of the crown, and he ruled with an iron sense of order. France under Philip was powerful, but it was also strained. Wars were expensive. Administration was growing. The machinery of governance required constant funding. And like many medieval kings, Philip found himself perpetually short of money. This financial pressure would prove essential to the scandal that followed. The Knights Templar were one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. Founded during the Crusades, they began as warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, they evolved into something unprecedented, a transnational military, religious, and financial institution. They owned land across Europe, operated a sophisticated banking system, and answered directly to the Pope, not to kings. They were wealthy, they were independent, and they were untouchable. For a monarch like Philip IV, this was intolerable. The Templars held vast resources that the crown could not access. They lent money to kings, including Philip himself. They operated outside royal jurisdiction. They existed as a state within a state, cloaked in religious authority and protected by centuries of tradition. To Philip, they represented not just wealth, but a challenge to sovereignty. At first, relations between the crown and the Templars were cordial. Philip used their financial services. He benefited from their infrastructure, but as his debts grew and his patience thinned, his attitude hardened. The idea took shape slowly. The Templars could not be taxed easily. They could not be dissolved by royal decree, but they could be destroyed through scandal. And so, accusations began to surface. In 1307, rumors spread of heresy within the order. Secret initiation rituals, denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, worship of strange idols,
Morale corruption.
sexual impropriety. The charges were shocking, lurid, and deeply offensive to medieval Christian sensibilities. They were also, crucially, difficult to disprove once spoken aloud. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip acted. Across France, Templar knights were arrested simultaneously. There were no warnings, no negotiations, no trials beforehand. Men who had lived openly as respected members of society were seized in the night, shackled, and thrown into prisons. The scale of the operation was staggering. It was coordinated, precise, and ruthless. The accusations poured forth immediately. Under interrogation, many Templars confessed. Some recanted. Some resisted. Torture was used extensively, sanctioned by the crown and carried out with grim efficiency. Medieval justice did not require consistency, only confession. Philip presented the arrests as an act of piety. He framed himself as a defender of the faith, cleansing corruption from within Christendom. Yet his motivations were far from purely spiritual. By accusing the Templars of heresy, Philip placed them beyond legal protection. Their wealth could be seized, their lands redistributed, their debts erased. And still there was one obstacle: the Pope. The Knights Templar answered directly to papal authority. Only the Pope had the right to investigate or dissolve the order. At the time, the Pope was Clement V, a Frenchman who owed much of his position to Philip's influence. The balance of power between king and pope had already been strained during Philip's reign. He had clashed with previous popes over taxation and authority. The papacy had been weakened. The king knew this. Philip applied relentless pressure. Clement hesitated at first. He ordered inquiries. He expressed concern about the methods used. But the momentum was already unstoppable. Public opinion had been poisoned. Confessions, coerced or not, circulated widely. The idea that the Templars were guilty had settled into the collective imagination. Slowly, reluctantly, Clement yielded. In 1312, the Knights Templar were officially dissolved by papal decree. Their property was redistributed, much of it absorbed by the crown or funneled into other institutions. The order that had once guarded pilgrims and shaped crusading history ceased to exist. But the scandal did not end with dissolution. The fate of the Templars' leadership remained unresolved. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the order, had initially confessed under torture. Later, he recanted publicly, declaring the order innocent and his confession false. This act sealed his fate. In 1314, de Molay was burned at the stake in Paris, along with other senior Templars. According to legend, as flames consumed him, he called out to God, summoning both the Pope and the King to face divine judgment within a year. Whether the curse was real or not, its timing was uncanny. Pope Clement V died later that same year. King Philip IV died shortly after, following a hunting accident. Within months, both figures at the center of the scandal were gone. Medieval Europe noticed. The destruction of the Knights Templar became one of the most enduring scandals of the age, not because it involved personal immorality, but because it revealed how far a king could bend truth to serve power. Philip IV did not merely exploit rumor. He manufactured it, amplified it, and used it as a weapon. This scandal unsettled Europe deeply. If an ancient, respected order could be erased through accusation alone, what safety existed for anyone else? Chroniclers struggled to reconcile Philip's outward piety with his actions. Some praised his defense of the faith. Others hinted darkly at injustice. Over time, suspicion lingered. The Templars became martyrs in memory, their guilt increasingly doubted by later generations. Philip's reign ended with France more centralized than ever, but also haunted by the knowledge that royal authority had crossed an invisible line. This scandal teaches us something essential about medieval kingship. Power did not only corrupt through indulgence or desire, corrupted through control, through the ability to define truth, to shape narrative, and to silence opposition. In a world without free press or independent courts, scandal became a tool of governance. As the embers cool on the pyres of Paris, and the Templar crosses fade from banners and shields, we are left with a quiet unease. A kingdom strengthened, but a moral boundary crossed. An order destroyed, not by battle, but by accusation. And as night settles once more over medieval Europe, the question lingers softly in the dark. If truth can be commanded by a crown, what remains sacred? Let us move gently onward. Part 3. The King Who Lost His Crown to Rumor. We move now into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, into a world where authority was never simple and kingship was always contested. This was a land of overlapping loyalties, powerful nobles, restless cities, and an emperor whose legitimacy depended not only on blood, but on reputation. In this fragile landscape, scandal did not merely embarrass a ruler, could dissolve an entire reign. This is the story of Emperor Henry IV, a king whose private conflicts became public disasters, and whose downfall was shaped as much by rumor, ritual humiliation, and moral accusation as by armies or rebellion. Henry IV became King of Germany in 1056, at just 6 years old. From the beginning, his reign was marked by instability. Regents ruled in his name. Noble factions maneuvered for influence. The young king grew up in an atmosphere thick with distrust and rivalry, learning early that authority had to be asserted constantly or it would slip away. When Henry came of age, he ruled with determination, but also with a temperament that alienated many. He was impulsive, forceful, and deeply resistant to limits on his power. These traits might have been manageable in a simpler kingdom, but Henry ruled at a moment when one of medieval Europe's most explosive conflicts was igniting. The struggle between church and crown. At the center of this struggle was the question of investiture. Who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots? The king who governed the land, or the pope who governed souls? For centuries, kings had appointed church officials, gaining loyal administrators and access to wealth. The reforming papacy of the 11th century sought to end this practice, declaring it corrupt and sinful. Henry IV refused to yield. At first, the conflict was legal and political. Letters were exchanged, councils convened, but soon it became personal. Pope Gregory VII accused Henry of simony, corruption, and moral unfitness. He painted the king not merely as disobedient, but as sinful, a ruler whose private life and public actions disqualified him from divine favor. In medieval Europe, this was devastating. In 1076, Gregory took an extraordinary step. He excommunicated Henry IV. Excommunication was not just a religious punishment. It was a political weapon. It severed a king from the church, released his subjects from obedience, and cast doubt on his right to rule. Suddenly, Henry was not merely unpopular. He was spiritually contaminated. Rumors spread immediately that Henry was immoral, that he consorted with unworthy companions, that God had withdrawn his blessing. Chroniclers amplified these accusations, often blurring political grievances with moral condemnation. German nobles seized the opportunity. They rebelled, claiming loyalty to the church and framing their resistance as righteous. They demanded that Henry reconcile with the Pope or face deposition. The king found himself isolated, not because he had lost armies, but because he had lost legitimacy. This is where the scandal deepened. In the winter of 1077, Henry undertook one of the most famous journeys in medieval history. He crossed the Alps in brutal conditions, traveling to the fortress of Canossa in northern Italy, where Pope Gregory had taken refuge. What followed was a scene that echoed through centuries of memory. Henry stood barefoot in the snow, dressed in penitential garments, waiting outside the castle gates. For 3 days he remained there, fasting and exposed, seeking absolution. This was not simply a religious ritual. It was public humiliation on a continental scale. Kings were not meant to beg. Gregory eventually lifted the excommunication, but the damage was irreversible. The image of the king in the snow burned itself into medieval consciousness. Some saw it as humility, others saw it as weakness. Many saw it as proof that Henry's authority had been broken. The scandal was no longer about investiture alone. It was about a king who had been publicly stripped of dignity. Even after reconciliation, rumors continued to swirl. Henry was accused of insincerity, of false repentance, of moral corruption masked by ceremony. The narrative of unfitness clung to him, feeding ongoing rebellion. Civil war erupted. Rival kings were elected. Loyalties fractured. Henry fought for decades to reclaim control, alternating between military victories and political collapses. Each setback revived the old accusations. Each defeat was framed not as strategic failure, but as divine judgment. As Henry aged, the scandal took on a new and devastating form. His own son, Henry V, turned against him. The younger Henry allied himself with reformist forces, presenting himself as a righteous alternative to a morally compromised father. He accused the elder Henry of tyranny, impiety, and corruption. These accusations were not new. They were carefully inherited. In 1105, Henry IV was forced to abdicate. He was imprisoned, humiliated again, and stripped of imperial authority. Though he later escaped, his power was gone. He died in exile in 1106. Even in death, the scandal followed him. Because of his conflicts with the church, Henry was denied burial in consecrated ground. His body was moved repeatedly, left unburied for years. A king without a resting place. A ruler whose memory remained unsettled. What makes Henry IV's story so striking is that the scandal did not hinge on a single shocking act. There was no dramatic murder, no forbidden lover, no sudden crime. Instead, it was the slow erosion of reputation, the accumulation of accusation, the transformation of political disagreement into moral condemnation. In medieval Europe, this was one of the most dangerous forms of scandal. To be called immoral was to be called illegitimate. The church's language carried enormous power. By framing Henry's resistance as sin rather than strategy, his enemies reshaped the entire conflict. Nobles could rebel without appearing disloyal. Sons could overthrow fathers under the banner of righteousness. The crown itself became unstable not because it lacked soldiers, but because it lacked moral certainty. Henry IV's reign left a deep scar on medieval political thought. Kings learned that authority could no longer rely solely on force. Public image, religious alignment, and moral perception had become essential. A king could be undone not by armies, but by narrative. As we let this story settle, there is a quiet sadness to it. A ruler who never found solid ground. A crown that slipped not in a moment, but slowly, through cold winters and whispered doubts. A life spent fighting not just enemies, but the idea that he was unworthy to rule. In the stillness that follows, one truth becomes clear. In medieval Europe, scandal did not always shout. Sometimes it prayed. Sometimes it wrote letters. Sometimes it waited patiently in the snow. And sometimes it took a crown without ever raising a sword. Let us drift onward. Part 4. The king accused by his own court. We remain in medieval France, but we move forward in time, into a reign that began with strength, confidence, and the promise of stability. The crown passed smoothly, the kingdom appeared secure, and the king himself was widely respected. Yet beneath this orderly surface, one of the most unsettling royal scandals of the Middle Ages quietly unfolded. A scandal not born from rebellion or invasion, but from accusation so intimate and so corrosive that it hollowed out the monarchy from within. This is the story of King Louis IX's grandfather, Philip III's son, and most notably King Philip V of France, and the scandal that shook the Capetian dynasty through whispers of adultery, betrayal, and treason within the royal family itself. But to understand this scandal fully, we must begin slightly earlier, with the reign of Philip IV's sons and the fragile continuity of the Capetian line. Philip IV of France, whose destruction of the Knights Templar we explored earlier, left behind 3 sons who would each inherit the crown in turn. On the surface, this succession appeared stable, even enviable. The Capetians had ruled France for centuries with remarkable continuity. The crown passed cleanly from father to son, reinforcing the idea that divine order itself favored this family. Yet this continuity would fracture dramatically. The scandal that followed did not erupt in distant battlefields or rebellious provinces. It unfolded within the royal household, among queens, princesses, and trusted companions. Its damage was not measured in land lost, but in legitimacy poisoned. The scandal is known today as the affair of the Tour de Nesle. At the center of it were 3 royal women: Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Burgundy. They were married into the royal family, queens and future queens of France, bound not only by vows but by their role as bearers of dynastic future. Margaret was married to Louis, the eldest son of Philip IV and future King Louis X. Blanche was married to Charles, the youngest son. Joan was married to Philip, the middle son, who would later become Philip V. In medieval monarchy, queens were symbols as much as people. Their bodies carried the future of the realm. Their fidelity was not a private matter. It was the foundation of succession itself. Any doubt cast upon a queen's virtue was a threat to the entire kingdom. The scandal began quietly, as scandals often do. A rumor here, a suggestion there, servants noticing patterns, a pair of knights too familiar with the royal women, gifts exchanged, meetings at odd hours. The men in question were 2 brothers, Gautier and Philippe Diony, minor knights of noble birth but modest standing. They were not powerful enough to threaten the crown directly, but close enough to be noticed. The one who noticed was Isabella of France, sister to the 3 princes and Queen of England. While visiting Paris, Isabella observed interactions that unsettled her. Whether driven by genuine concern, political calculation, or personal grievance, she reported her suspicions to her father, King Philip IV. Philip listened. What followed was not an open inquiry, but a trap. The knights were watched. Evidence gathered quietly. Eventually, arrests were made. Under interrogation, the men confessed to adulterous relationships with Margaret and Blanche. Whether these confessions were entirely truthful is impossible to know. Medieval interrogations were not gentle, and confession was often extracted as much as it was given. Still, the scandal exploded. The implications were catastrophic. If the queens had committed adultery, then the legitimacy of their children was in question. The bloodline itself was contaminated. Philip IV acted swiftly and brutally. The two knights were publicly tortured and executed, subjected to prolonged and spectacular punishment meant to cleanse the realm through suffering. Their bodies were mutilated and displayed, a warning etched into flesh. The queens were arrested. Margaret and Blanche were imprisoned in harsh conditions. Their hair was cut, their status stripped away. They were confined to isolated towers, exposed to cold, hunger, and humiliation. Joan, wife of Philip, was also accused, though evidence against her was weaker. She was imprisoned but treated with slightly more restraint. The court reeled. France had never seen its queens treated this way. The sanctity of royal marriage, once unquestioned, now lay in ruins. Chroniclers struggled to describe the moment. Some spoke of moral decay, others of divine punishment. All recognized the enormity of what had occurred. When Philip IV died shortly after, the scandal did not fade. It followed his sons to the throne. Louis X became king first. His wife, Margaret, remained imprisoned. Her fate was sealed not by a verdict, but by neglect. She died in captivity under mysterious circumstances. Officially of illness, unofficially suspicion lingered. Louis remarried quickly, desperate for a legitimate heir. When he died unexpectedly just 2 years later, his infant son lived only a few days. The line was already fraying. Philip, husband of Joan, ascended next as Philip V. Here the scandal deepened further. Joan had been accused but never fully condemned. Philip defended her fiercely. He insisted on her innocence. He secured her release and crowned her queen. This decision was itself controversial. Many nobles believed Joan had been complicit. Others suspected political maneuvering. The court remained divided, and trust in the monarchy eroded further. Philip V ruled competently, even effectively, but the stain of scandal lingered. His legitimacy was constantly questioned, not because of his actions, but because of the unresolved accusations against his wife. When Philip died without male heirs, the succession crisis intensified. Charles IV, the youngest brother, took the throne. His wife, Blanche, remained imprisoned. She was divorced and removed from royal life entirely. Charles remarried, but he too died without a surviving son. In the span of just over a decade, the direct Capetian male line collapsed. The affair of the Tour de Nesle did not cause this collapse alone, but it poisoned the ground on which succession stood. It introduced doubt where certainty had once existed. It made questions of legitimacy unavoidable. When the throne passed to a cousin, Philip VI, beginning the Valois dynasty, England contested the succession. Isabella's son, Edward III, claimed the French crown through his mother. The result was the 100 Years' War. A conflict that would devastate France for generations can trace part of its origin back to whispered accusations in the royal household, to a scandal that transformed queens into prisoners and kings into suspects. What makes this scandal so chilling is its intimacy. There were no foreign enemies, no invading armies. The danger came from within, from bedrooms and corridors, from trust betrayed or perceived to be betrayed. For medieval society, the idea that queens could fall was deeply unsettling. Queens were meant to embody order, fertility, and moral clarity. Their collapse symbolized something far larger than individual failure. The affair of the Tour de Nesle taught medieval Europe that monarchy was more fragile than it appeared, that bloodlines could be disrupted not only by war, but by doubt. That scandal could infect legitimacy itself. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it showed how quickly the machinery of power could turn inward, how swiftly queens could be stripped of protection, how silence and imprisonment could replace ceremony and reverence. As we sit quietly with this story, there is a heavy stillness to it. Lives ended not with swords, but with confinement. Reputations destroyed without public defense. A dynasty weakened not by external threat, but by suspicion gnawing at its core. In the dim towers where queens waited and wondered, medieval monarchy revealed one of its darkest truths, that crowns rest not only on heads, but on belief, and belief, once shaken, is difficult to restore. Let us drift onward, carrying this unease softly with us. Part 5. The King Whose Marriage Shattered Christendom. We move now into England once more, but into a later medieval world, one already restless, already stretched thin by war, plague, and shifting ideas of authority. The crown still gleamed, ceremonies still unfolded with ritual precision, yet something fundamental was changing beneath the surface. Power was becoming more personal. Kings were asserting not just political dominance, but moral and spiritual autonomy. And in this changing world, one king's private desire ignited a scandal so vast that it fractured the religious unity of Western Europe. This is the story of King Henry VIII and the marriage scandal that did not merely embarrass a crown, but reshaped the spiritual map of an entire continent. Henry VIII ascended the English throne in 1509, young, confident, and widely admired. He was athletic, educated, charismatic, and devout. Early in his reign, few would have predicted that he would become one of history's most controversial monarchs. He styled himself as a defender of the Catholic faith, wrote theological arguments, and enjoyed the support of the Church. At the center of his early reign stood his queen, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had been married previously to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who died young. After years of diplomatic negotiation and a papal dispensation, she married Henry, and for a time the marriage appeared stable. Catherine was pious, dignified, and respected. She embodied the ideal medieval queen, loyal, fertile, and morally upright. Yet as the years passed, something crucial failed to materialize: a male heir. Catherine suffered multiple pregnancies, but only one child survived infancy, a daughter named Mary. In medieval monarchy, this was perilous. England had lived through brutal civil wars fueled by disputed succession. A female heir alone felt dangerously insufficient to Henry and his advisors. At first, Henry's concern was quiet. He prayed. He sought medical advice. He blamed fate. But gradually, his anxiety hardened into conviction. Henry came to believe that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that God had withheld a male heir as punishment for marrying his brother's widow. He fixated on a passage from Scripture that condemned such unions. Whether this belief was genuine or convenient is impossible to separate. What matters is that Henry embraced it fully. And then another figure entered the story, Anne Boleyn, and was young, intelligent, and sharply aware of court politics. Unlike many women who had caught the king's attention before, she refused to become a discreet mistress. She demanded legitimacy, marriage, a crown. Henry was captivated. What began as desire soon transformed into obsession. Henry did not simply want Anne, he wanted a future secured through her. A restored sense of divine approval. But there was a problem. The Pope would not grant an annulment. Catherine was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful men in Europe. Granting an annulment would offend him deeply. The Pope hesitated, delayed, equivocated. Years passed in legal arguments, appeals, and negotiations. To Henry, this delay became intolerable. What had once been a private marital crisis turned into public scandal. Court factions formed. Supporters of Catherine clashed with supporters of Anne. The legitimacy of the king's intentions was debated openly. England watched as its king argued, pleaded, and finally threatened the church itself. This is where the scandal transformed into something unprecedented. Henry decided he did not need the Pope. Through a series of legal and political maneuvers, Henry asserted royal supremacy over the church in England. He declared himself the highest authority in religious matters within his realm. Parliament passed acts severing ties with Rome. Monasteries were dissolved. Clergy were forced to swear loyalty to the crown. All of this ultimately stemmed from a marriage. Henry annulled his union with Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was cast aside, stripped of her title, and separated from her daughter, and was crowned queen amid tension and quiet outrage. The scandal was immense. Never before had an English king defied the Pope so openly. Never before had a marriage dispute triggered such sweeping institutional destruction. The religious unity that had bound England to Europe for centuries shattered. Yet even this was not the end, and failed to produce the long-awaited male heir. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Pregnancies followed, then miscarriages. Henry's affection cooled. Court politics shifted again as swiftly as they had before. Soon, rumors began to circulate, and was accused of adultery, of incest, of treason. The charges were sensational and deeply suspicious. Historians still debate their validity. What matters is how easily the narrative turned against her, and was arrested, tried, and executed in 1536. The woman for whom Henry had broken with Rome was gone within 3 years of becoming queen. The scandal, however, endured. England remained separated from the Catholic Church. Religious upheaval continued for generations. Henry married again and again, his personal life becoming a public spectacle. Each marriage carried political consequences. Each divorce or execution reinforced the sense that royal desire now dictated national destiny. What makes Henry's scandal uniquely medieval, despite its proximity to the early modern world, is its structure. A king's private anxiety about succession, a personal attraction elevated into political necessity, a religious institution forced to bend, then break. Henry did not simply scandalize his court. He rewrote the rules of authority. To supporters, he was a reformer freeing England from foreign control. To critics, he was a tyrant who destroyed sacred tradition for personal gratification. To ordinary people, he was a king whose marriages reshaped their faith, their communities, and their daily rituals. This scandal teaches us something profound about monarchy. When a king's will becomes absolute, even the most ancient institutions can be reshaped to accommodate it. What begins in a bedchamber can end in monasteries burning, laws rewritten, and consciences divided. As we sit quietly with this story, there is a sense of slow inevitability. A man convinced of his own righteousness, a system unable to restrain him, a continent watching as unity fractures, not with a single blow, but through years of stubborn insistence. Henry VIII's scandal did not fade with time. It hardened into doctrine. It became law. It became identity. And in the quiet that follows, one question lingers, soft but insistent. When a king believes his desire is divine will, who can tell him otherwise? Let us move gently onward. Part 6. The Mad King and the Crown That Fractured. We drift now into a reign where scandal did not arrive through desire, conspiracy, or calculated defiance, but through something far more unsettling. The slow, unpredictable unraveling of a king's mind. In medieval Europe, madness in a ruler was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a constitutional crisis, a spiritual dilemma, and a breeding ground for rumor, fear, and manipulation. This is the story of Charles VI of France, a king whose illness shattered confidence in the crown and helped plunge France into chaos, civil war, and eventually foreign domination. Charles VI ascended the French throne in 1380 at the age of 11. At first, his reign seemed promising. As he grew into adulthood, he was handsome, energetic, and widely admired. He rode at the head of armies, presided over court with confidence, and inspired hope that France, long strained by war with England, might finally find stability. For a time, he was known as Charles the Beloved. Then, without warning, everything changed. In 1392, while traveling with his army through a forest on a hot summer day, Charles suddenly attacked his own men. Drawing his sword, he killed several knights before being restrained. When it ended, he collapsed unconscious. It was the first major episode. From that moment on, the king's mind became unreliable. He suffered recurring bouts of mental illness that could last days, weeks, sometimes months. During these episodes, he failed to recognize his wife, his children, even himself. At times, he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. At others, he wandered the palace halls screaming, violent and disoriented. In medieval Europe, there was no clear language for mental illness. There was no diagnosis, no treatment in the modern sense. What existed instead were interpretations. Sin, divine punishment, demonic influence, moral weakness. Each explanation carried political weight. At first, the court tried to manage the situation quietly. Regents governed in the king's name. Rituals continued. The illusion of stability was preserved. But madness is not easily hidden, especially when it grips a crown. Word spread. Rumors circulated through Paris and beyond. The king was cursed. The king was possessed. The king was no longer fit to rule. Some whispered that God had withdrawn his favor from France entirely. In a society where kingship was intertwined with divine order, this was devastating. Power began to shift away from the king himself and toward those who could act in his name. His uncles, his brother, his wife. Competing factions formed, each claiming to protect the realm during the king's incapacity. This is where scandal took root. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, found herself in an impossible position. She was blamed by some for the king's illness, accused of moral corruption, foreign influence, even witchcraft. Chroniclers portrayed her as extravagant, promiscuous, manipulative. Whether these accusations reflected reality or misogyny sharpened by fear is difficult to determine. What matters is that they spread quickly and widely. At the same time, rival noble factions exploited the king's condition. The Burgundians and the Armagnacs maneuvered relentlessly, each seeking control of the government during Charles's episodes. Decisions made in his absence were later questioned. Orders given during his clarity were contradicted during his illness. France drifted into internal conflict. The most chilling moment came in 1393, during an event later known as the Bal d'Ardens, the Ball of the Burning Men. At a masquerade held by the court, several nobles dressed in costumes made of flammable material. Charles, himself in disguise, joined the revelry. A torch was brought too close. The costumes caught fire. 4 men burned alive before the horrified court. Charles survived only because his aunt threw her skirt over him to smother the flames. To contemporaries, the symbolism was unbearable. The king dancing among burning men, fire consuming nobility, survival through chance rather than control. Chroniclers seized upon the image, weaving it into a narrative of divine warning and royal recklessness. From that moment on, confidence in the monarchy eroded further. As Charles's episodes grew more frequent, the question of succession loomed ominously. His son, the Dauphin, was young and vulnerable. The kingdom's enemies watched closely. England, still locked in conflict with France, saw opportunity. The scandal of Charles's madness was not just that he suffered. It was that his suffering created a vacuum. Authority fractured, loyalty fragmented, violence escalated. In 1407, the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, was assassinated in the streets of Paris. The murder was justified openly as a political necessity. Civil war followed. France descended into chaos. Throughout it all, Charles remained a tragic figure. During moments of clarity, he was reportedly gentle, ashamed, desperate to restore order. During episodes, he was lost, unreachable, terrifying even to those who loved him. The court continued to use his name. Decrees were issued, treaties signed, but everyone knew the truth. The king was no longer ruling. By the time the English invaded again in earnest, culminating in the disaster at Agincourt in 1415, France was divided and weakened. When Charles later signed a treaty disinheriting his own son in favor of the English king, many believed he had been manipulated during an episode of illness. The crown itself seemed unmoored from reason. Charles VI died in 1422. His reign remembered less for what he did than for what could not be done in his name. He left behind a shattered kingdom, a traumatized court, and a legacy of fear. This scandal was unlike the others. There was no single villain, no clear betrayal, no forbidden love or calculated destruction. Instead, there was uncertainty, anxiety, the terror of watching authority slip away without anyone fully responsible. For medieval Europe, this was one of the most disturbing possibilities of all. A king could be immoral and still rule. A king could be cruel and still command. But a king who could not recognize himself called into question the very foundation of monarchy. Charles VI's madness forced Europe to confront an unspoken truth: that kings were human, fragile, vulnerable to forces beyond their control. And once that truth was exposed, it could not be fully hidden again. As we let this story settle, the image that lingers is not one of fire or blood, but of confusion. A crown resting on a head that could not always bear it. A realm waiting endlessly for clarity that never quite returned. In the quiet aftermath of this reign, medieval Europe learned that scandal did not always come from sin or ambition. Sometimes it arrived through sorrow. Let us drift onward. Part 7. The king who was overthrown by his own image. We return now to England, to a reign that began in splendor and promise, but ended in quiet captivity and unanswered questions. This is a story not of madness, nor of religious rupture, nor of open rebellion at first glance. It is a story about perception, about how a king's image, once carefully crafted, slowly turned against him, and how scandal in the medieval world could grow not from a single crime, but from the accumulation of unease. This is the story of King Richard II, a ruler whose fall revealed just how fragile kingship could be when belief dissolved. Richard II became king in 1377 at the age of 10. He inherited the crown at a moment of deep instability. England was exhausted by war with France. The Black Death had transformed society. Labor shortages, rising wages, and shifting social expectations unsettled the traditional order. From the very beginning, Richard's reign was shaped by tension between old structures and new realities. As a child king, he ruled through councils and regents. Yet even in youth, Richard displayed a strong sense of his own dignity. He believed profoundly in the sacred nature of kingship, not merely as a role, but as an identity bestowed by God. This belief would shape everything that followed. Richard came of age during one of the most explosive moments in medieval English history, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. When rebels marched on London, demanding economic and social reforms, Richard met them personally. He spoke calmly. He promised concessions. He defused immediate violence. To many contemporaries, this moment seemed heroic. The young king standing alone before an angry crowd, asserting royal authority through presence rather than force. But this event also taught Richard a dangerous lesson. He learned that appearance could substitute for power, that theatrical authority could calm chaos, that kingship itself, performed convincingly, could command obedience. As Richard grew older, he began to rule not merely as a monarch, but as a symbol. He surrounded himself with loyal favorites, men who reinforced his sense of grandeur and devotion to ceremony.
Robert de Bere,
Michael de la Pole. Later, others who owed their rise not to lineage, but to proximity to the king. This pattern unsettled the nobility. English kingship relied on cooperation with powerful lords. Richard, however, increasingly viewed these lords not as partners, but as threats. He resented constraints on his authority. He believed opposition to him was not political disagreement, but moral disloyalty. Scandal crept in quietly. The king was accused of extravagance, of excessive taxation, of rewarding favorites at the expense of established nobles. Chroniclers described a court obsessed with pageantry and display while the kingdom struggled. More troubling were accusations of vengeance. In the late 1380s, a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant challenged Richard's governance. They accused his favorites of treason and corruption. Richard was forced to submit. His allies were executed or exiled. For a time, it appeared that the king had been humbled. But Richard did not forget. Years later, once he had reasserted control, Richard began to retaliate. This retaliation was methodical and chilling. Former opponents were arrested. Trials were held. Property was confiscated. Executions followed. Richard framed these actions as justice, but many saw them as personal revenge disguised as law. The scandal here was not simply violence. Medieval kings executed enemies regularly. What disturbed contemporaries was the sense that Richard ruled through memory rather than mercy, that grievances never faded, that loyalty was enforced not through trust, but through fear. At the same time, Richard's court grew increasingly insular. Ritual became more elaborate. The language surrounding the king grew more exalted. Richard emphasized his sacred status, demanding submission not just to his authority, but to his person. This created distance. Kings were meant to inspire awe, but also accessibility. Richard's insistence on reverence made him feel remote, almost abstract. Subjects began to speak of him not as a ruler, but as a figure removed from shared reality. The scandal intensified when Richard exiled his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke was a powerful noble, popular, and respected. His exile seemed disproportionate, motivated more by personal mistrust than public necessity. When Bolingbroke's father died, Richard seized his inheritance, effectively disinheriting him. This decision proved catastrophic. While Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned to England. He claimed at first only to seek his rightful lands, but support gathered quickly. Nobles defected. Cities opened their gates. What is striking is how little resistance Richard encountered. This was not a sudden uprising. It was a quiet withdrawal of belief. When Richard returned, he found himself isolated. His authority, once so carefully performed, no longer convinced. He was captured with minimal violence. Parliament convened. Charges were read. The accusations were sweeping. Tyranny, misrule, excessive taxation, abuse of power, violation of law. The language was legal, but beneath it lay something deeper. A declaration that Richard had failed not just administratively, but morally. He was forced to abdicate. Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned, moved between castles, increasingly forgotten. He died in captivity in 1400, officially of starvation. Unofficially, suspicion lingered. His end, like his reign, was wrapped in uncertainty. The scandal of Richard II was not scandal in the modern sense. There were no lurid crimes, no forbidden lovers, no shocking confessions. Instead, there was a slow erosion of trust. Richard believed too deeply in the idea of kingship, and not enough in its relationships. Medieval monarchy depended on shared belief. Once nobles, clergy, and commons alike ceased to believe in a king's judgment, the crown itself weakened. Richard's fall demonstrated that divine right alone was insufficient if not paired with restraint, adaptability, and consensus. Chroniclers later portrayed Richard as tragic, sensitive, artistic, a man ahead of his time in some ways, yet fatally rigid in others. His scandal became a lesson in how authority must be felt as fair, not merely displayed as sacred. As we sit quietly with this story, the image that remains is one of silence. A king who spoke eloquently of his own divinity, but who could not hear the quiet withdrawal of loyalty around him. A throne that remained physically intact even as belief slipped away. In medieval Europe, scandal did not always erupt in chaos. Sometimes it arrived as absence, as doors opened without resistance, as a crown set aside with solemn formality. Richard II learned too late that kingship was not only something to be proclaimed. It had to be shared. Let us drift onward. Part 8. The king whose death became the scandal. We move now into the twilight of medieval England, into a reign so short and so violent that it left behind more questions than answers. This is a story where scandal did not unfold gradually, nor was it whispered into existence over years. Instead, it arrived suddenly, brutally, and then refused to settle. A king died, and the uncertainty surrounding his death became one of the most enduring scandals of the Middle Ages. This is the story of King Edward V, the boy king who vanished before he could truly rule, and whose disappearance haunted England for generations. Edward V never wore the crown in ceremony, yet he is counted among England's kings. He ascended to the throne in 1483 at the age of 12, following the sudden death of his father, Edward IV. The Wars of the Roses had left England exhausted and deeply suspicious. Loyalties shifted easily, trust was fragile, and power, once seized, was rarely relinquished voluntarily. Edward IV had ruled with relative strength, balancing noble factions through force of personality and strategic marriages. His unexpected death left a dangerous vacuum. His heir was young, impressionable, and surrounded by ambitious adults. At the center of this storm stood Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward V's uncle. Richard had been a loyal supporter of his brother Edward IV. He was experienced in warfare, respected in the north, and known for his efficiency. In his brother's will, Richard was named Lord Protector, charged with governing the realm until Edward V came of age. On paper, the transition appeared orderly. In reality, it was anything but. As Edward V traveled from Ludlow to London for his coronation, he was intercepted by his uncle. Members of the young king's maternal family, the Woodvilles, were arrested. Power shifted swiftly into Richard's hands. Edward V was taken to the Tower of London. Officially, this was standard practice. The Tower served as a royal residence as well as a prison. Kings often stayed there before coronation. First, nothing seemed amiss. Then Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was brought to the Tower as well. Two princes, together, behind walls. At this moment, the scandal began to breathe. Richard of Gloucester claimed that Edward Ivy's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a prior betrothal. This declaration rendered Edward V and his brother illegitimate, stripping them of their claim to the throne. Parliament accepted this argument with startling speed. Richard was crowned King Richard III. The princes remained in the Tower. They were seen less and less, then not at all. No announcement was made. No explanation offered. The boys simply disappeared from public view. In medieval England, silence was rarely neutral. Rumors surged almost immediately, whispers in taverns, sermons laced with implication, chroniclers writing carefully, hinting rather than accusing outright. The princes, people said, had been murdered, smothered in their sleep, poisoned, secretly removed. Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. What made this scandal so powerful was its ambiguity. There was no body,
No confession.
no trial, just absence. Richard III denied nothing explicitly. He also explained nothing. His reign was brief and embattled, plagued by rebellion and suspicion. Even those who supported him struggled to defend the unexplained disappearance of the boys. In medieval political culture, legitimacy depended on lineage and divine favor. The presence of living rivals undermined authority. Their disappearance invited accusation. Richard's enemies seized the narrative. Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the throne, presented himself as a moral alternative. He promised restoration, justice, closure. He married Elizabeth of York, sister of the missing princes, symbolically healing the dynastic wound. When Henry defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the scandal did not end. It intensified. Henry VII had every incentive to paint Richard III as a tyrant and a murderer. Chroniclers under Tudor patronage solidified the image of Richard as a villain, responsible for the deaths of the princes. Plays, histories, and poems echoed the accusation. Yet certainty remained elusive. Centuries later, bones discovered in the tower reignited debate. Forensic analysis suggested they could belong to children of the correct age. But proof remained incomplete. The mystery endured. Edward V's scandal is unique among medieval kings because it centers on absence rather than action. He ruled in name only. His reign produced no policies, no battles, no decrees. Yet his disappearance reshaped England's future. The scandal destabilized Richard III's authority. It justified rebellion, provided moral cover for regime change, and it embedded suspicion into the foundation of the Tudor dynasty. For medieval society, the idea of murdered princes was deeply disturbing. Children symbolized continuity and divine blessing. Their removal suggested not just political cruelty, but cosmic disorder. Edward V became a ghost king, a symbol of innocence lost, a question mark at the heart of English monarchy. As we sit quietly with this story, the atmosphere feels colder than those before it. There is no confession to analyze, no motive fully proven, only a locked tower and a vanished future. In medieval Europe, scandal did not always require evidence. It required plausibility, and sometimes silence was enough. Let us drift onward, carrying the echo of unanswered questions with us. Part 9. The king whose private cruelty became public horror. We move now into Scandinavia, into a colder landscape of stone fortresses, dark forests, and contested crowns. Here, kingship was still deeply personal. Rule depended not only on lineage, but on the ability to command loyalty from powerful nobles and rival kingdoms alike. In this world, reputation mattered intensely. A king could be feared, even hated, and still rule. But there were limits. When fear tipped into revulsion, scandal followed. This is the story of King Erik XIV of Sweden, a ruler whose private violence and paranoia spilled so openly into public life that his reign collapsed under the weight of its own terror. Erik XIV became King of Sweden in 1560, inheriting a kingdom that was rising in power but deeply unstable. Sweden had recently broken from Danish dominance and was asserting itself as a regional force. The monarchy was still consolidating authority over nobles who had long been accustomed to independence. Erik was intelligent, ambitious, and intensely sensitive. He saw himself as a Renaissance monarch, interested in science, astrology, and grand visions of imperial destiny. He believed deeply in his own exceptionalism. From early on, however, there were signs of instability. Eric was suspicious of his advisors. He believed conspiracies surrounded him. He oscillated between charm and rage, between generosity and cruelty. Court moods shifted quickly. One day he would reward a noble lavishly. The next accuse him of treason. At first, these traits were dismissed as eccentricity. But eccentricity in a king can become dangerous very quickly. Eric's paranoia focused increasingly on the Swedish nobility, particularly the powerful Sture family. The Stures were influential, respected, and seen by many as potential rivals to the crown. To Eric, they became symbols of betrayal waiting to happen. The scandal began to take shape not through rumor, but through action. In 1567, Eric had several members of the Sture family arrested on charges of treason. They were imprisoned at Uppsala Castle. A trial was planned, but events moved faster than law could contain. One night, Eric personally entered their prison. What happened next shocked even a hardened medieval court. The king attacked the prisoners himself. He stabbed Nils Sture and others with his own hands. Guards followed his lead, killing additional captives. Blood soaked the chambers. Nobles died not by legal execution, but by the king's uncontrolled violence. This was not punishment. It was slaughter. When news spread, horror rippled across Sweden. Kings ordered executions regularly, but they did not usually wield the blade themselves. Eric's direct participation shattered expectations of royal restraint. It blurred the line between sovereign justice and personal rage. The scandal exploded. Chroniclers struggled to describe the event without fear. Nobles panicked. If the king could kill powerful aristocrats with his own hands, no one was safe. Loyalty became meaningless. Survival replaced allegiance. Eric's behavior deteriorated further. He isolated himself. He relied on astrologers and omens. He suspected even his closest advisors. He oscillated between remorse and renewed suspicion. At times, he appeared deeply ashamed of the murders. At others, he justified them as divine necessity. Public confidence evaporated. Foreign powers watched carefully. Denmark and Poland saw opportunity. Within Sweden, resistance hardened. The king's brothers, John and Charles, emerged as alternative centers of authority. Eric attempted to stabilize his reign by marrying a woman of common birth, Karen Mansdottir. He elevated her to queen, a move that scandalized the nobility further. To Eric, the marriage represented love and loyalty untainted by aristocratic conspiracy. To the court, it symbolized how far the king had drifted from political reality. The final collapse came swiftly. In 1568, Eric was overthrown by his own brothers. He was imprisoned, moved between castles, and increasingly forgotten. His reign officially ended, though his life did not. Eric spent years in captivity. During this time, rumors circulated constantly. He was poisoned slowly. He was starved. He was driven further into madness deliberately. The truth remains uncertain. He died in 1577, likely from arsenic poisoning. Eric XIV's scandal was not subtle. It did not depend on whisper or insinuation. It was loud, visceral, and impossible to ignore. A king who killed with his own hands crossed an unspoken boundary. Medieval society accepted violence from authority, but demanded distance. The sword of justice was meant to be symbolic. Eric made it personal. What makes this scandal particularly disturbing is how quickly it spread fear. One act revealed too much. It showed that the king's inner world was no longer governed by law or restraint. Once that truth became visible, the crown itself became unbearable. Eric's legacy lingered as a warning. Kings could be cruel. Kings could be ruthless. But kings who could not control themselves inspired not obedience, but terror. As we sit quietly with this story, the atmosphere feels heavy, almost claustrophobic. Stone walls closing in. Footsteps echoing down corridors where trust once lived. A ruler alone with his thoughts, convinced of betrayal everywhere. In medieval Europe, scandal did not always begin with sin or ambition. Sometimes it began when a king revealed too much of himself. And once revealed, it could not be unseen. Let us drift onward. Part 10. The king whose love became a national catastrophe. We drift now into Bohemia, into a kingdom perched at the crossroads of Europe, where German princes, Czech nobles, and imperial ambition overlapped in uneasy balance. This was a land shaped by trade, learning, and faith, a place where kings were expected to be cultured as well as commanding. And for a time, Bohemia had such a king, educated, eloquent, and crowned with promise. Yet one man's private attachments, unchecked and fiercely defended, transformed admiration into resentment, and resentment into open revolt. This is the story of Wenceslaus IV, a ruler whose reign became synonymous with scandal, paralysis, and collapse. Wenceslaus IV inherited the Bohemian crown in 1378 and the title of King of the Romans soon after. He was the son of the formidable Charles IV, one of the most respected rulers of medieval Europe. Charles had transformed Prague into an imperial capital, fostered learning, and stabilized the realm. His son inherited not only titles but towering expectations. At first, Wenceslaus appeared capable. He was educated, spoke multiple languages, and showed an interest in philosophy and law. Chroniclers noted his intelligence and wit, yet they also noted something else, a deep aversion to responsibility. Where his father had delighted in governance, Wenceslaus avoided it. He preferred hunting to councils, companionship to administration, private pleasures to public duty. This alone might have been tolerated had he delegated effectively. Instead, Wenceslaus withdrew unevenly, leaving governance fragmented and unpredictable. The scandal began not with crime, but with absence. Bohemia's nobility found themselves waiting endlessly for decisions. Petitions went unanswered. Disputes lingered unresolved. Authority drifted. Power pooled around those closest to the king, not those best equipped to rule. At the center of this growing resentment were Wenceslaus's favorites. Kings throughout medieval Europe had favorites, but Wenceslaus's attachment to his inner circle was intense and unwavering. Men of modest background rose quickly, bypassing established elites. One companion in particular, Jan of Pomuck, later St. John of Nepomuk, became entangled in controversy. Conflicting accounts survive, but accusations swirled of abuse of authority, personal favoritism, and royal rage. What is clear is that Wenceslaus reacted violently when challenged. In 1393, Jan of Pomuck was arrested, tortured, and thrown into the Vltava River, where he drowned. Whether this was a political act, a personal vendetta, or an explosion of frustration remains debated. What mattered to contemporaries was the message it sent. The king could kill without restraint. Trust evaporated. The Bohemian nobility began to organize, framing their opposition not as rebellion, but as necessity. They accused Wenceslaus of neglecting justice, endangering the realm, and surrounding himself with unworthy companions. These accusations gained traction quickly because they matched lived experience. The scandal deepened when Wenceslaus's failures extended beyond Bohemia. As king of the Romans, he was expected to govern the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Instead, he rarely appeared. Imperial politics stagnated. Princes grew impatient. Meetings were postponed or ignored. the machinery of empire ground to a halt. In medieval Europe, kings were expected to be visible. Absence was interpreted as indifference, and indifference as unfitness. By the early 1400s, confidence in Wenceslaus had collapsed. German princes convened without him. They debated openly whether the empire could continue under such leadership. The language used was careful but devastating. They spoke of incapacity, of neglect, of scandalous behavior unbecoming a king. In 1400, Wenceslaus was deposed as king of the Romans. He remained king of Bohemia, but even there his authority was tenuous. He had been publicly judged and found wanting. The sacred aura of kingship had been punctured. This was not a deposition won by armies. It was won by consensus that the king no longer mattered. Wenceslaus's response was erratic. At times, he attempted reform. At others, he retreated further into isolation. His temper worsened. Alcohol became a refuge. His court grew smaller, more defensive, more disconnected from reality. The scandal that followed him was not lurid, but corrosive. He was accused of drunkenness, cruelty, and indolence. Chroniclers described a king asleep while his kingdom burned. Satirical poems circulated. The idea that Bohemia was ruled by a man uninterested in ruling became a grim joke across Europe. Yet beneath the mockery lay real danger. Religious tensions were rising. Reform movements challenged the church. National identity sharpened. Bohemia teetered on the edge of upheaval. A strong king might have contained the pressure. Wenceslaus could not. When he died in 1419, reportedly after a fit of rage, the dam broke. Bohemia plunged into the Hussite Wars, a series of religious and national conflicts that devastated the region. His brother Sigismund inherited a realm already fractured beyond easy repair. In retrospect, Wenceslaus's scandal feels quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to murders and disappearances. Yet its impact was immense. A king who would not rule created space for chaos. A ruler who valued personal comfort over public duty weakened institutions meant to outlast individuals. His scandal was not excess, but abdication of responsibility. Medieval chroniclers struggled to condemn him cleanly. He was not entirely monstrous. He was not wholly incompetent. He was simply absent when presence mattered most. As we sit quietly with this story, the image that lingers is one of emptiness. A throne occupied by a man elsewhere, councils waiting in cold halls, petitions gathering dust, anger fermenting in silence. In medieval Europe, scandal did not always require blood. Sometimes it was enough for a king to stop showing up. Let us drift onward. Thank you once again for tuning into tonight's episode. Please subscribe so you can continue to keep up with our nightly episodes. I hope I've been able to ease you into your slumber. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Good night.